The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training range as 23 fresh recruits lined up for their first marksmanship assessment. Among them stood David Matthews, a quiet young man whose eyes held secrets that none of his fellow soldiers could have imagined. While others chatted nervously about their backgrounds and boasted about their shooting experience from hunting trips back home, David remained silent, his weathered hands steady despite the obvious tension in the air. Sergeant Williams paced in front of the line of recruits, his boots crunching against the gravel. His voice boomed across the range as he explained the rules of engagement and safety protocols. The other recruits hung on every word, but David's mind wandered to memories he had tried desperately to bury. The smell of gunpowder in the air transported him back to places where silence meant survival, and one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death for an entire mission. "Matthews!" Sergeant Williams barked suddenly, causing several recruits to jump. "You seem distracted. Perhaps you'd like to go first and show us what civilian life has taught you about handling a rifle?" David nodded quietly and stepped forward to the firing line. The other recruits exchanged glances, some smirking at what they assumed would be an embarrassing display from the soft-spoken newcomer. Tommy Peterson, a cocky recruit from Texas who had been bragging about his deer-hunting skills all morning, whispered to his neighbor, "This should be entertaining. Guy looks like he's never held anything more dangerous than a pencil." The rifle felt familiar in David's hands, though he hadn't touched one in 3 years. His fingers automatically found their positions as muscle memory kicked in. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, pushing away the flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm him. Afghanistan, the mountains, his team, the mission that changed everything. As David took his position, the other recruits continued their quiet commentary. Some placed informal bets on how poorly he would perform. Sergeant Williams watched with professional interest, noting the subtle signs that most would miss, the way David's breathing naturally regulated, how his stance shifted to something more stable than what basic training typically taught. The methodical way he checked the weapon, despite having watched the demonstration just moments before. The target stood at various distances, from 100 to 600 meters. Standard military protocol called for engaging the closest targets first, but David's eyes were drawn to the furthest marker. In his mind, he could hear his old spotter's voice. "Distance is just a number, mate. It's the wind that'll get you every time." He tested the air with a blade of grass, noting the slight crosswind from the east. The first shot echoed across the range with a sharp crack that seemed to hang in the air longer than usual. Through the spotting scopes, observers could see a perfect center mass hit on the 600-meter target. The casual chatter among the recruits died down slightly, but most assumed it was beginner's luck. Even Sergeant Williams raised an eyebrow but remained professionally neutral. David's second shot found the 500-meter target with the same precision, then the 400. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, and devastatingly accurate. By the time he had worked his way down to the closest targets, complete silence had fallen over the range. The only sounds were the methodical crack of rifle fire and the soft whistle of wind through the valley. When David set down the rifle and stepped back from the firing line, Sergeant Williams approached the spotting scope with growing curiosity. What he saw made him pause. Every single shot had found its mark with surgical precision, not just hitting the targets but grouping so tightly that some shots had passed through holes created by previous rounds. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the range observers, a seasoned instructor who had seen thousands of recruits over his 20-year career. "I've never seen shooting like that from anyone below the rank of Master Sergeant, and even then..." The other recruits stared at David with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. Tommy Peterson's earlier smugness had evaporated completely, replaced by genuine bewilderment. "How the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. David's response was barely above a whisper. "Practice." He didn't elaborate, didn't boast, didn't even acknowledge the impressed stares from his fellow soldiers. Instead, he simply stepped back into formation and waited for the next recruit to take their turn. As the morning progressed and other recruits took their shots, it became increasingly clear that something extraordinary had just occurred. The best performer after David managed to hit 6 out of 10 targets at various ranges, a respectable showing for a new recruit. Most struggled to consistently hit anything beyond 200 meters. David's performance wasn't just superior, it was in a completely different league. Sergeant Williams found himself studying David's personnel file during the lunch break, searching for any mention of prior military service or specialized training. The file was surprisingly thin. David Matthews, age 26, from a small town in Colorado. High school education, worked various odd jobs before enlisting. No mention of military family, no indication of formal shooting training, no red flags or remarkable achievements. On paper, he was the most ordinary recruit in the entire company. But Sergeant Williams had been in the military long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. The way David handled the weapon, his shooting stance, the methodical approach to engaging targets at distance, these weren't skills learned at a local gun range or during weekend hunting trips. This was the kind of precision that came from years of specialized training and real-world application under the most demanding circumstances. During afternoon drills, David continued to blend into the background, never volunteering answers, never seeking attention, always following orders without question or complaint. When other recruits struggled with equipment or procedures, he would quietly offer assistance without making them feel inadequate. His demeanor suggested someone much older than his 26 years, someone who had seen enough of the world to understand the value of humility and silence. As evening approached and the recruits were dismissed to their barracks, Sergeant Williams made a decision that would change everything. He placed a call to his commanding officer, requesting permission to run a more detailed background check on David Matthews. Something about the young man didn't sit right with him, and in his experience, extraordinary skills usually came with equally extraordinary stories. The other recruits spent the evening speculating about David's background, creating increasingly elaborate theories about where he might have learned to shoot with such devastating accuracy. Some suggested he was the son of a famous sniper. Others wondered if he had grown up on a ranch where precise shooting was a daily necessity. None of them came close to the truth. David lay in his narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft breathing of his sleeping bunkmates. The day had gone better than he had hoped, but he knew that his performance at the range had attracted unwanted attention. He had tried so hard to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd of eager young soldiers looking to serve their country. But some skills were impossible to hide, no matter how hard you tried to suppress them. 3 years had passed since he last held a rifle in an operational capacity. 3 years since the mission that ended his previous career and forced him to disappear into civilian life. He had hoped that time would be enough, that he could start fresh with a new identity and serve his country again in a different capacity. But as he drifted off to sleep, David couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed new life was about to come unraveling, one perfectly placed shot at a time. 3 days after the remarkable shooting display, Colonel Harrison sat in his office reviewing a classified file that had just arrived from military intelligence. The morning coffee had grown cold in his mug as he read through documents that painted a very different picture of David Matthews than what appeared in his enlistment papers. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine and immediately changed the nature of everything happening at the training facility. According to the classified records, there was no David Matthews from Colorado. The Social Security number belonged to a construction worker who had died in an industrial accident 2 years earlier. The birth certificate was expertly forged and the employment history was a carefully constructed fiction. However, the fingerprints told a different story entirely. They belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael "Ghost" Thompson, formerly of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, one of the most elite military units in the world. The file revealed a soldier whose accomplishments read like something from a military thriller novel. Over a 4-year period with the SAS, Michael Thompson had completed over 60 successful missions across 3 continents. His confirmed kill count stood at 137 enemy combatants, making him one of the most lethal snipers in modern military history. His longest confirmed kill was recorded at 1,247 meters under extreme weather conditions in the mountains of Afghanistan. But the file also contained a section that explained why Michael Thompson had vanished and David Matthews had appeared in his place. 3 years earlier, during a classified operation in a Middle Eastern country that officially didn't exist on any mission reports, Thompson's 4-man team had been compromised. Intelligence suggested that their position had been betrayed by someone within their own command structure, though the investigation had been inconclusive. The mission had gone wrong in the worst possible way. Thompson had been forced to watch through his rifle scope as his 3 teammates were captured, tortured, and executed by enemy forces while he remained hidden in an overwatch position. For 36 hours, he had maintained his concealment, calling in airstrikes and providing intelligence that ultimately allowed a larger rescue operation to succeed. But by the time help arrived, his team was dead, and Thompson had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. The official report stated that Staff Sergeant Thompson had been honorably discharged due to post-traumatic stress disorder and had been provided with a new identity for his own protection. The concern was that enemy forces might seek revenge against him or his family for the damage he had inflicted during and after the compromised mission. What the report didn't mention was that Thompson had also refused to trust his own command structure ever again, believing that someone at the highest levels had deliberately sacrificed his team. Colonel Harrison immediately summoned Sergeant Williams to his office. When the training instructor arrived, he found his commanding officer studying aerial photographs of desert terrain that looked like it had been bombed repeatedly. "Sergeant, I need you to tell me everything you observed about Recruit Matthews during the shooting assessment," Colonel Harrison said without preamble. "Every detail, no matter how small." Williams recounted the morning's events, describing David's shooting performance in detail. He mentioned the unusual stance, the methodical approach to engaging distant targets first, and the almost supernatural accuracy that had left seasoned instructors speechless. "Sir, I've been training soldiers for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it," Williams concluded. "The kid shot like someone who had been doing it professionally for decades. But according to his file, he's just a small-town civilian with no military background." Colonel Harrison slid the classified file across his desk. As Williams read through the documents, his expression changed from curiosity to amazement to deep concern. When he finished, he looked up at his commanding officer with questions written across his face. "The man you know as David Matthews is actually one of the most elite soldiers this country has ever produced," Colonel Harrison explained. "He's also a man who has every reason to distrust military authority and who has been living under a false identity for 3 years. The question now is what we do with this information." Meanwhile, David continued his training routine with the other recruits, unaware that his true identity had been discovered. During hand-to-hand combat training, he deliberately held back, allowing other recruits to score points against him while carefully concealing the deadly fighting skills that had been drilled into him during SAS selection. When the group practiced tactical movement, he had to consciously make mistakes to avoid demonstrating the level of fieldcraft that would have immediately marked him as a professional soldier. But holding back was becoming increasingly difficult. During a simulated patrol exercise, David watched in growing frustration as his fellow recruits made basic mistakes that would have gotten them killed in a real combat situation. Tommy Peterson walked directly through an obvious ambush site without checking for cover. Another recruit, Sarah Chen, consistently failed to maintain proper spacing that would prevent multiple casualties from a single explosive device. The instructor, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, seemed competent enough, but David could see gaps in the training that concerned him. The tactical procedures being taught were outdated, based on conventional warfare rather than the asymmetric threats that dominated modern conflicts. The communication protocols were sloppy, and the equipment checks were insufficient for real-world operations. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their weapons in the barracks, Tommy Peterson struck up a conversation with David. "You know, Matthews, you've been pretty quiet about your background. Where exactly did you learn to shoot like that?" David continued cleaning his rifle without looking up. "My grandfather taught me when I was young. We used to hunt together." "Must have been some grandfather," Peterson replied skeptically. "I grew up hunting with my dad and uncles, and none of us could shoot like that. You were hitting targets at ranges that most hunters never even attempt." Other recruits gathered around, their curiosity finally overcoming their initial intimidation. Sarah Chen asked about his hometown, trying to draw him into conversation about civilian life. Marcus Williams, a former college athlete who had joined the Army for adventure, wanted to know about David's work history and what had motivated him to enlist. David deflected each question with vague, non-committal answers that satisfied no one but didn't invite further inquiry. He had become an expert at creating just enough personal detail to seem normal while avoiding anything that might contradict his carefully constructed identity. But he could sense that his fellow recruits were becoming suspicious of his evasiveness. The real test came 2 days later during advanced marksmanship training. Sergeant Williams had set up a more challenging course based on Colonel Harrison's specific instructions. The targets were placed at longer distances, some partially concealed, others positioned to simulate real combat scenarios. The wind conditions had picked up significantly, making accurate shooting much more difficult. As the other recruits struggled with the increased complexity, David found himself facing an impossible choice. He could continue to underperform and maintain his cover, but doing so might compromise the training and safety of his fellow soldiers. Or he could demonstrate his true capabilities and risk exposure, but potentially save lives if these recruits ever found themselves in actual combat situations. When his turn came, David stepped to the firing line with the weight of multiple competing loyalties pressing down on him. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Sergeant Williams watching intently, along with 2 officers he didn't recognize who had arrived at the range that morning. Something in their bearing suggested that this was more than just routine observation. The first target appeared at 800 meters, partially concealed behind a barrier that simulated an enemy position. The wind was gusting from multiple directions, making ballistic calculations complex. David could either take a safe shot that might miss but wouldn't reveal his true skill level, or he could thread the needle with the kind of precision that had made him legendary among special operations communities. As he settled into his shooting position, David made a decision that would change everything. He was tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be less than what years of elite training had made him. If his cover was going to be blown, it might as well be while doing something that could help his fellow soldiers survive whatever challenges lay ahead. The shot rang out across the range with distinctive crack that seemed to echo longer than usual. Through the spotting scopes, observers watched in stunned silence as the bullet found its mark with mathematical precision, striking the target dead center despite the challenging conditions and partial concealment. Colonel Harrison lowered his binoculars and turned to Sergeant Williams. "I think it's time we had a conversation with our mysterious recruit," he said quietly. "But we need to be very careful about how we approach this. We're dealing with someone who has every reason to distrust military authority, and if we handle this wrong, we might lose him forever." The summons came at 0600 hours the following morning. David was called to Colonel Harrison's office while the other recruits were still struggling through their morning physical training routine. As he walked across the base, David's mind raced through possible explanations for the meeting. His performance at the range had been too revealing, too precise to maintain his carefully constructed facade any longer. When he entered the office, David found Colonel Harrison waiting behind his desk, flanked by Sergeant Williams and a woman in civilian clothes whose bearing immediately screamed intelligence officer. On the desk lay an open file that David recognized with a sinking heart. His real military records, complete with mission photographs and classified operational summaries. "Please take a seat, Staff Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Harrison said quietly, using David's real name for the first time in 3 years. The words hit David like a physical blow. For a moment, he considered denying everything, maintaining the David Matthews fiction that had protected him for so long. But the evidence spread across the desk made such denials pointless. Instead, he sat down and waited for whatever was coming next. "I want you to know that we understand why you've been hiding," the colonel continued. "We've read the classified reports about Operation Nightfall and what happened to your team. We know about the betrayal, the investigation that went nowhere, and your decision to disappear rather than trust a system that failed you when it mattered most." The woman in civilian clothes leaned forward slightly. "My name is Director Sarah Mackenzie, Defense Intelligence Agency. I was part of the team that created your new identity after Afghanistan. We've been keeping track of your whereabouts, not to interfere, but to ensure your safety. When you enlisted under your cover identity, it triggered certain alerts in our system." David's hands clenched involuntarily as memories of that final mission flooded back. The sandy hills of Afghanistan where everything had gone wrong, the radio calls that went unanswered, the sight of his teammates being executed while he remained helpless in his concealed position, knowing that revealing himself would only add one more body to the count without saving anyone. "You want to know why I came back?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years of civilian life, 3 years of trying to be normal, and I couldn't do it. Every night I see their faces. Every time I close my eyes, I hear Rodriguez calling for backup that never came. I joined the regular army because I thought maybe if I served again in a different capacity, I could find some kind of peace. Colonel Harrison nodded, understanding. The psychological evaluations from your discharge indicated severe PTSD and survivor's guilt, but they also noted your unwillingness to engage with traditional therapy or support systems. You've been dealing with this alone for 3 years. "I don't trust easily anymore," David admitted. "When your own command structure sells out your team, when someone at the highest levels decides that 4 good soldiers are acceptable losses for some political objective they won't even name, it changes you. I came back because I still believe in the mission, but I don't believe in the people running it." Director Mackenzie pulled out a tablet and showed David a series of photographs. They were recent surveillance images of known terrorist operatives, some of whom David recognized from his time with the SAS. "The man who betrayed your team has been identified," she said carefully. "Colonel James Morrison, who was feeding intelligence to enemy forces in exchange for information about his captured son. Morrison was arrested 6 months ago and is currently serving a life sentence in federal prison. The investigation that you thought went nowhere actually continued for 2 years after your discharge." David stared at the photographs, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed anger. "You're telling me this now? After 3 years of thinking that the people responsible were still out there, still in positions where they could do it again? We couldn't contact you without potentially compromising your safety," Mackenzie explained. "Morrison had connections to several international criminal organizations who had put significant bounties on your head. We needed them to believe you were truly dead or disappeared before we could neutralize those threats." Sergeant Williams spoke up for the first time. "The question now is what happens next. Your shooting performance has been observed by half the training staff on this base. Word is going to spread. especially after yesterday's demonstration. We can't put that genie back in the bottle." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying David carefully. "We have a proposition for you, but I want you to understand that there's no pressure here. You've served your country with extraordinary distinction, and you've earned the right to whatever life you choose." David looked up, curious despite his wariness. "We're establishing a new training program for elite marksmen," the colonel continued. "Not special operations, but advanced training for regular Army units who are being deployed to high-risk areas. These soldiers need the kind of skills that you could teach them, skills that could mean the difference between coming home alive or coming home in a flag-draped coffin." "You want me to be an instructor?" David asked. "We want you to develop and lead the entire program," Mackenzie interjected. "Full reinstatement of your rank, back pay for the time you've been out, and complete autonomy over curriculum and training methods. You would report directly to Colonel Harrison with no interference from higher command levels that you don't trust." David was quiet for several long moments, processing the offer. Teaching other soldiers, passing on the skills that had kept him alive through impossible situations, ensuring that future teams wouldn't suffer the fate that had befallen his own unit. It was appealing in ways he hadn't expected. "What about my fellow recruits?" he asked finally. "The ones I've been training with for the past month? If you accept this position, they would become your first class," Colonel Harrison replied. "You've been observing their strengths and weaknesses, their mistakes and potential. You know better than anyone what they need to learn to survive in real combat situations." David thought about Tommy Peterson's reckless confidence, Sarah Chen's intelligence but lack of tactical awareness, Marcus Williams's physical abilities that weren't being properly channeled. He had been mentally cataloging their deficiencies and imagining how to correct them without even realizing it. "I have conditions," David said slowly. "First, complete transparency. If there's intelligence relevant to my safety or the program, I want to know about it immediately. No more protecting me from information I need to make informed decisions." Mackenzie nodded. "Agreed." "Second, I choose my own security protocols. If I'm going to be visible again, if my identity is going to be known, then I need to be able to protect myself and my students according to my own standards." "Also agreed," Colonel Harrison said. "Third, if I ever discover that students are being put at risk for political reasons, if I ever suspect that my program is being used to create expendable assets rather than skilled soldiers, I walk away immediately. No arguments, no negotiations, no attempts to change my mind." "That's a reasonable condition," the colonel replied. "In fact, it's exactly the kind of attitude we hoped you would maintain." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where his fellow recruits were practicing basic maneuvers under Sergeant Williams' guidance. They had potential, all of them, but they also had dangerous gaps in their knowledge that could prove fatal in real combat situations. "When would this program begin?" he asked. "Immediately if you accept," Mackenzie replied. "Your recruits would be transferred to advanced training status, and you would have full authority to design their curriculum. We've already identified additional candidates from other training companies who have shown exceptional promise." David turned back to face the three officers. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something approaching hope. The ghosts of his fallen teammates would never leave him completely, but perhaps he could honor their memory by ensuring that other soldiers received the training they needed to survive impossible situations. "I accept," he said simply. "But I want to be the one to tell my recruits the truth about who I am and why I'm here. They deserve to hear it from me, not through rumors or official announcements." That afternoon, David gathered his fellow recruits in an empty classroom and told them everything. He explained about his real identity, his service with the SAS, the mission that had changed everything, and his decision to return to military service under a false name. He described the new training program and what it would mean for their future as soldiers. The reaction was a mixture of shock, excitement, and profound respect. Tommy Peterson, who had been so cocky about his hunting experience, stared in amazement as he realized he had been sharing a barracks with one of the most elite soldiers in modern military history. Sarah Chen immediately began asking technical questions about advanced tactics and long-range shooting techniques. "Why us?" Marcus Williams asked. "Why choose our group for this advanced program?" David looked at each of them in turn, seeing past their current limitations to their potential. "Because you remind me of my old team," he said quietly. "You have the raw materials to become exceptional soldiers. You just need someone to show you how to put them together." As the months that followed would prove, David Matthews may have been a fiction, but Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson was very real, and he was about to create the most effective military training program the Army had seen in decades, one that would save countless lives and produce a new generation of elite soldiers who carried forward the legacy of those who had fallen before them. The silent recruit had finally found his voice, and what he had to say would change military training forever.